So, Dr. Joshua Schimel is a professor of at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology. His research is at the intersection of microbial and ecosystem ecology, and his work focuses on how the environment controls the composition of microbial communities in soil and how, in turn, those microbes regulate whole ecosystem processes. So over the course of his career, Dr. Schimel became interested in communication and science storytelling. And after designing a graduate class on scientific writing, wrote the book Writing Science, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded, based on what he was teaching. As a graduate student, I found his book to be a tremendous resource to develop best writing practices. So today I'm excited that he will be sharing some of these ideas with us. And thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. I think everything I have to say today is really much more than about just writing science, since most of what I learned about writing is from people who actually know something about writing, and that's not usually us scientists. Okay, wait, I think I'm still in Zoom. There we go. So let's start by asking why we write, and that's just to sort of riff off the old World War II documentary, Why We Fight, into that image. And why do we write when we're writing really almost anything, but certainly when we're writing scientific work? We want to report our research. We want to enable others to replicate our work. We think we have something to say. And in the context of science communication, really that all fits into the kind of publish or perish, but we have something that we want to do. In contrast, we can ask, well, why do we read? Well, we read because we want to learn new ideas, we want to learn new methods, we want to pick up new stuff, we want to enrich our understanding, whether that be of the technical work or of a policy issue. So it always comes down to me for the question of why should I read your paper? You know, as a professor, I read student papers because someone pays me to, not because I have any actual interest in what they say. But it comes to that, well, how will reading your paper help me? What's its value to me? And if you're trying to talk to a legislator, it's even more so the case. They're looking at, well, what are you trying to tell me? What do I learn from this paper? So as an author, we write to advance our professional goals. And that's a need to publish to advance our career. As a reader, we read to advance our professional goals, but that's to learn for ourselves. And you can see the problem here. Those are not in line with each other. I don't have to read your work. You're not paying me to read it. So as an author, if you want people to pay attention to what you have to say, you need to align what you do with what a reader is looking for and what a reader needs. It's not just dumping stuff because that'll end up in the trash heap. You need to think about your readers and how to communicate to them. What this also means, of course, is that writing isn't what our school teachers taught us. It's not just about constructing sentences and paragraphs. Writing is about changing readers' understanding of the world through your written work. And that's what we're really thinking about when we talk about writing. It's not just crafting words. And in any communication context, communication isn't just what you think you're giving, but what the audience actually gets. And so you see it again, think about who you're writing for and your audience. It's what you do, but it's about them. And that means you need to know who they are, what they know, and what they value, and how you present your message is going to have to adapt to deal with those different audiences. Is this a group of politicians? Is it a group of scientists? And so my sort of principle here is that it is the author's job to make the reader's job easy. Now, when we're actually doing technical science communication, the reader's job is never going to be easy because what we do is hard, but it's your job to make it as easy as it can be for you. And so I'll leave this flashing in your eyeballs for a few seconds to just be annoying about it, but to pound in that message is that particularly after you finish your PhD, you will spend most of your time writing about science instead of actually at the bench doing science. And ultimately, everything we achieve is going to be through our written words. We write proposals, we write papers. Our most important communications are what we do on paper, not in the lab. Now, that means that if English isn't your native language, writing sentences may be the hard part of writing science, but you'd be wrong. The hard part is always figuring out what it is you really want to communicate and the big picture of how do I do that, not just the small stuff. You can hire an editor to help you write sentences. You can't hire an editor to help you write papers because you're the one who knows the story you're trying to tell. So as we look at this, there are multiple sort of hierarchical levels, and I'll use a military analogy here because I think it works. At the tactical level, that's about using words to assemble sentences. Then there's the grand strategic level, which is really about the story. And then there's the stuff in the middle where you're putting the small pieces together to achieve the larger goal. Now, these different pieces, strategy is the important one. Because if your story's wrong or flawed in some way, you've already lost. I mean, I grew up during the Vietnam War era, and I remember people saying, well, we never lost a battle in Vietnam. To which the answer always, of course, is, well, that might be true, but it's irrelevant because we lost the war because we were stupid at the strategic level. So strategy is more important. You can fix tactics. You have to get the sort of big picture. And that's about story structure, and getting the right pieces in the right places. Now, science is hard. We have very complex thoughts we're trying to communicate. We have new things to discuss. And that means that creates both story issues and language issues. You know, for example, several years ago, there was this sort of game going around called the Upgoer 5 Challenge. The idea of explaining complex ideas using only the 1,000 most common words in English. And really, it was a fiction and a misrepresentation. You ask, what the hell is an Upgoer 5? Well, they meant that, the Saturn V rocket. An Upgoer is a rocket. But that's an Upgoer. That's an Upgoer. That Upgoer means nothing until you've learned the meaning of that new compound noun. You've created a new word, you've given it a new definition, and that really is the problem. For a new idea, you need a new term to talk about it, and you need to educate people in that. So we have these challenges of complex ideas that we're trying to explain. We also face what's known as the curse of knowledge. I know what I know. You know what you know. If I'm trying to communicate to a readership, I might not know what they know. And they may not know what I know. And if I'm talking using my language and assuming everybody speaks it, they may be misunderstanding me. And it's very hard to sort of move yourself into the perspective of your readers of, okay, what do I need to explain? How do I streamline this? How do I capture that? And one of the more amusing examples of this one that I've seen, other than on a far side of what we say to our dogs, of course, my dog over there actually understands more than just their name, was this one that came off Yahoo a month or 3 or 4 ago. Napkin tops are the risky trend fashion people actually pulling off. And I saw this, I was wondering, well, should I call it fashion editor? Or if I take a different reading the word pulling off, should I call the police because somebody is forcefully stripping some poor woman? The words could be read either way, and this editor assumed they knew that what they meant. You could read it in a different way. It was presumably obvious to the fashion. It never occurred that they might actually pulling off could be a physical action that was a sexual violation. Who knew? Also keep in mind that writing is hard. We never get it right the first time. And I deeply embrace the AMLA model of the shitty first draft. We talk about SFDs in my group all the time. It's just an SFD. It's a way of minimizing the pain of those first drafts. A good second draft, a terrific third draft, or maybe a good enough 23rd draft. But the idea is that putting something on paper initially is just a way to be able to look at what you've got so you can think about it. This idea of think first and write second is wrong. It's an iterative process to deal with the fact that it is hard and the communication is hard. Now, when I think about science, I think about this sort of flow that goes from data to information to knowledge to understanding. And I saw this definition at some website about a scientific paper is a written report describing original research results. And for in person, I'd ask you what your response to that is, but I'll just say I think it's utter rubbish. That misrepresents what a scientific paper is completely. Because if all you're doing is reporting research results, you're just giving me information. And there's too much information for my brain to assimilate. And what I want is understanding. I want to learn about stuff. I don't want to just accumulate trivia. So if it's not just reporting research results, keep in mind that a paper doesn't only present data, it interprets them. It's the interpretation that will make you famous, not the data. Paper tells a story about nature and how it works. All human communication is about storytelling, whether you're talking to a journalist, a politician, or your professional colleagues. You're telling them a story about how nature works. And don't worry about the idea that story carries some negative connotation. Journalists are just, if they're good, just as objective and rigorous as we are. And they're grounded in story because they know that's how people communicate. So a solid paper doesn't just give us information, actually gives us knowledge. And a really good paper provides novel understanding. So we can ask, which of these two books changed the world? Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, essentially his data, or this one, Origin of Species, which was his interpretation. I think we know the answer to that. We could also ask, why was this one of the most important pieces of raw data that has ever been generated in science? It's Rosalind Franklin's photo 51 of the X-ray diffraction image of DNA. How many of us can actually interpret that image? To me, it's just a piece of pop art. I only know why that tells me anything because someone told me what it tells me. I can't interpret it. The pen and ink drawing of the double helix structure, that I can understand. So if you write papers that only show us the data, report your research results, instead of interpreting them all the way to what it means, you will be losing out. Now, that's an important thing. How far can you take your story and interpretation? I'll skip that. Now, when we think about story, the key thing about a story is there are particularly critical pieces of a story that go in particular places, and we look for them there. And if you put them in the wrong place, they don't exist. And so all stories have really what I consider 4 core elements, and you can rearrange them somewhat for different types of audiences. The acronym I came up with that is OCAR. It's language that I think I invented, but was not the first person to have come up with basically the same terms. O is for opening, and it's where you hook your audience, you define the big problem, the large issue, who is this story about? And in so doing, you define really who your target audience is. And science, it's always, what is the problem you're trying to help solve? Then there's a challenge. What is the specific question or hypothesis you're trying to answer that by doing so will help solve the problem? And problem here doesn't necessarily mean an applied or a practical problem. It can be a purely intellectual problem, but there's something that you need to solve. Then there's all the action. What did you do to answer the question and by doing so help solve the problem? And then at the end, there's a resolution. How did what you do answer your question and help solve the problem? You need all those elements. Now, if you're writing for a journalist or for a politician, it all needs to be front-loaded. And they talk about that in the book and stuff more about how you do sort of more front-loaded story structures. But this is the classic structure of a specialist paper for a science audience. And of course, all stories are circular. You must come back to the beginning and show, by doing all this, how did we actually change our understanding of the world? Frodo has to go back to the Shire so we can see how he changed if we're reading Lord of the Rings. The movies sort of cut all that stuff out, but in the books, it only works because they don't stop until we see the sort of closing off of all those loops. So let's look at a few examples of openings because I think they're really critical, particularly if you're trying to hook people. So this is one from probably the most highly cited thing I will ever write. It says, since the late 1800s, nitrogen mineralization has been the perceived center point of the soil nitrogen cycle and the process that controls nitrogen availability to plants. And we can ask, what is the problem this is identifying? And where do we see that? And I'll argue it right there. By saying it's the perceived center point, I am implying that there must be something wrong with that perception because that first sentence is defining a problem, and that's the word that suggests there may be something wrong with that perception. Well, who's the target audience I'm aiming for with this? Well, it's anyone who cares about nitrogen cycling and the idea that the way we envisage it might be wrong. And of course, where did this get published? It got published in Ecology, top tier journal for all of ecologists. That was very deliberate. On the other hand, we could look at a paper like this, and this is an opening sentence from a paper that's submitted to Journal I'm an editor on. In China, overuse of nitrogen-containing fertilizers has led to soil acidification and increased aluminum toxicity of crop plants. So what's the problem that's defined here? Chinese farmers use too much fertilizer. That's the problem that's defined. They didn't have to specify China, which would have generalized it out, but they did. So they're defining a problem for Chinese farmers and Chinese scientists. The target audience, therefore, is Chinese agricultural scientists. We can ask, where was this published? I don't know. I know we rejected it from Soil Biology and Biochemistry because our journal targets an international community of fundamental scientists. We don't publish papers about Chinese problems, just as we don't publish problems about California or any other local problems. We publish papers about soil problems. We could have published a paper about over-fertilization. Those authors defined it too narrowly for our journal. And again, I work in California. I don't usually use that word because that's where I work. That's not what my stories are about. I use California as a place to work and as an example, not as a target. Here's a similar kind of example. This was for a proposal a colleague and I wrote a number of years ago now. It was fundamentally exactly the same body of work we were proposing to look at carbon cycling in bog-affected coastal forests in California. And we submitted it to 2 different agencies. One was NSF, and the other it wasn't actually Cal EPA, but given what the Kearney Foundation was focusing, that was the mindset of this kind of environmental protection focus. Again, the experiments and the measurements we were proposing, these 2 documents were identical. For the NSF, this was our opening sentence defining the problem. The influence of fog on ecological and hydrological processes in coastal zones is long and treat scientists. It's kind of a dull first sentence, but you can see why that might not be inappropriate for an NSF. This is targeting a broad, general scientific problem. Now put on your Cal EPA reviewer hat and think how you would react to that opening sentence. who the hell cares? Why is this my problem? You know, immediately that first sentence would get you rejected from Cal EPA, or at least put you on a very bad path. This was our opening sentence for that version of the proposal. California's coastal forests are among its most distinctive and treasured natural resources. Now put on your NSF reviewer hat, and I think you can think about how you would react in that mode. It's like, well, why should I care? This is not my job to protect California resources. I'm a National Science Foundation review. So how you frame the problem is about your audience. And then it's your job to sort of draw them towards the, what are you going to do and how am I going to solve your problem? But that's how you hook, and you need to think about it. And if you're thinking about communicating to policymakers, this kind of thinking is really important. How do I frame it as a problem they care about? And then once I've got their ear for 30 seconds on an elevator, maybe if we're talking one-on-one, I can think about how to draw them to, well, that's your problem, and I have a solution. But your opening is critical in that. So let's jump to conclusions and sort of skip all the rest. What did you learn? And this is where you close the circle from back to that opening problem definition. A good conclusions in a science paper will always do three things pretty much in sequence. One, highlight what were the key results, the key findings that you're building your conclusions from. Two, how do they answer the challenge? How do they answer the questions, answer the hypothesis you've identified? And three, how by doing that, you help solve the scientific problem that defined your paper in the beginning. So let's look at a quick example. This is from a paper I was a co-author on, lead author by a postdoc of mine, about dry seasons and WEOC is water extracted organic carbon. This is the last paragraph of that paper. You can see there are 3 sentences and what they each do. Physical processes, including during drying, may explain WEOC patterns observed in these grassland soils. That's the key result, synopsized broadly. 2, our measurements imply microbial access to soils, a rate-limiting step governing whether soils behave as sinks or sources of atmospheric CO2. That was kind of targeting the specific hypothesis and the narrow question. And then we take it back more globally to, in regions expected to see increased frequency of drying rewetting cycles, there may be greater destabilization of soil carbon. So now we're taking it back to the broad problem of soil carbon in semi-arid environments in 3 sentences. Result, sort of reiterating the action, reiterating the challenge, and then showing how we solved with the problem. There's no magic to this. This is all sort of structural, but there will be many ways to achieve that kind of goal. Now, how do you do a bad conclusions, which are surprisingly common? A bad conclusion will always just fail to tell us what we learned or what it means. So what is the worst conceivable conclusion statement? I'll argue it's this one. More research is needed to clarify the results, resolve the remaining uncertainties. It's a pretty common ending, a little bit less so than I think it once was. I understand this in terms of the humility of nothing we did is perfect and questions still remain. But if this is your last sentence, that really translates to, we failed. These were the things we were trying to answer and we didn't. No, that goes somewhere else in the document. You need to include those limitations. It should never be your closing comments. The second worst conceivable conclusion statement, I would argue, is probably even more common. And this research has important implications for something. And so here would be an example of a common sort of version of that. The results of this study will contribute to an understanding of the importance of residue management on greenhouse gases. To which my question will always be, well, how will it contribute? What did you do? What did I learn from this paper? And if I read statements like this, which I do all the time, I have questions. If you don't show me how your work answers the questions and solves the problems, and I'm going to think either you don't know how it solves the problem, in which case you're ignorant, but then why did you submit the paper? Or it doesn't actually help solve the problem, in which case I think you're lying, in which case I really wonder why you submitted the paper. Or you knew you needed a broad, encompassing statement, but didn't actually take the time to figure out a truly meaningful conclusion statement that shows us how you actually solve the problem. And this is very common. People see I need this sort of broad statement, but they don't really, I think, know why or what's supposed to do. And so I see this work has important implication and then all the time, and it bugs me every single time. And as a journal editor, you don't want to bug me. So we use and we cite your research because it teaches us something important. And your last words of a document are your most important ones. It's your take-home message. So you need to use it to actually show us what your new insights and new tools are. It's your job as the author to make my job as the reader easy, right? It's your job to show these things to me. Don't just say it's important, show us how it's important. This comes back to this core idea. You don't succeed as a scientist by getting papers published. Even if you got it in Nature, everyone may go, oh, wow, you got a paper in Nature. But if 3 years later, no one's ever cited it or used your work, that's pretty sad, and your peers will notice. You'd succeed as a scientist by getting your work used and cited, recognized. And that comes back to this, you need to show us as the readers why that works. The papers that get cited the most and the proposals that get funded are those that tell compelling stories. In proposals, this is really critical because when they're only going to fund 10 or 20% of the proposals that get funded, the ones that end up on the top of the pile are the ones where some reviewer just got so excited about your story that they will fight for your project. Even when there's an airplane to leave or someday back again, it's like, I got to rush to the airport, but I'm not going to do that until this proposal is at the high priority. And they may not even know you. It's about your idea. So you need to tell those stories. And that means getting the right pieces of information in the right place to really nail down the key points. Everything in between those, all the twists and turns, are less important. So I will leave this initial presentation at that point to really highlight the importance of kind of getting those critical messages right. That's why I do the getting started exercise, where I say just think about those first sentences, those key sentences for how do you define your opening, how do you define your challenge, what are the key sort of points that make the action, and then how do you end it with your final conclusion. In reality, in a real document, it will be more than 2 sentences, but in a short workshop form, focusing on that. Keep in mind as well that when you're going into groups, I have a motto: friends don't let friends publish bullshit. You do not serve your friends by going easy on them and saying, oh yeah, it's fine. No, you serve your friends by holding their feet to the fire to make things as good as they can, to help them overcome the curse of knowledge issues with, oh, that isn't clear to you? Oh, I thought it was clear. Well, if it's not clear to the readers, it's not clear. And in this, look at all of it. Think about who your target audience is. And if I were to revise that exercise, the first thing would be, who are you writing this for? And then it's really just fair game. Go at it. Be supportive of your friends, but be critical, because what you want them to do is to help make their writing as strong as they can and get into that mindset of how do you think about this as a critical reader, because we do. So I think we can break there and go out into breakout groups. Here we go. Shakespeare said brevity is the soul of wit. And I think learning how to condense your language is an important skill. What really forced me to learn how to write was this more prosaic language. The project description may not exceed 15 pages in SF. And of course, my first drafts are always 18 pages. And if your first drafts are 18 pages, and if you have one word on page 16, they won't even consider your proposal. There are 2 ways of solving that problem. One is you can write proposals that look like this. And this is the real first page of a proposal I actually got to review once. It's blurred to protect the guilty. The person who did this had too many words, and so they smashed them in like this. They were not thinking about the reader, because my initial reaction looking like at this as a reviewer is, I hate you. You're making me deal with this? Now, you don't want your reviewers hating you before they even read the first word, knowing that they're going to have just this horribly difficult job. This proposal is rejected even before I've read a word of it. Proposals, and this is one that I actually wrote, but that's not the important thing, is, gosh, there's white space that pulls your eyes in visually. Put a box on, do something to not make it appalling just at that first gut reaction, because that actually is important when you need to enlist me as an ally. But if you want to take an 18-page proposal and make that much white space, you need to learn how to cut words without cutting thoughts. And that is kind of an important distinction. So as we think about words and how to use words more effectively, the principle here is to write with clarity and energy. Everything else is rules, and rules are made to be broken. It's useful to know why they exist and how to break them. So if we think about language, I like to point out that if you want to throw a dart and hit the bullseye of a dartboard, there are 2 ways you can achieve that goal. One is you can learn how to throw straight. The other is you can nail so many boards up over all the rest of the dartboard that the only thing left to hit is the bullseye. A lot of people write this way by trying to qualify and cover and cover their ass to such a degree that we can't actually see what it is they're trying to say. And of course, I see a lot of writing that looks more like this that makes me dizzy from trying to figure out what dartboard are you even trying to aim at. So I want to spend a little time talking about some of the common issues in writing. One, of course, is this idea of jargon. Everybody thinks that scientists use a lot of jargon. My definition of jargon, though, is a term where there's a perfectly adequate plain language equivalent or some other term where people don't know what your word means. That's in contrast to a technical term, which is where there isn't a plain language equivalent, or where using it would actually confuse people. But just like in that upgoer thing, we have a lot of stuff to talk about that you can't start at ground zero every time you need to. So jargon isn't just a complex technical term. It's an unnecessarily complex term. Now, one of the things that leads us into those is what Roy Peter Clark defines as the ladder of abstraction. At the highest level of that ladder are these very broad level concepts, evolution by natural selection, nitrogen cycling, plate tectonics. Those frame where we work. We never really talk about those. At the very finest scale, there are the actual details. What is the shape of a finch's beak? How much N your crop took up? That's sort of the words within our senses. In the middle, we talk about things like Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and evolution, which I still don't know what it means. We talk about these conceptual ideas. We're defining things to talk about them. These are concepts for experts that most people outside our field don't know. This is where we actually live in our communication. And these are the terms we need to be careful when we bring them up of, can we assume our audience knows them, in which case they're just technical terms, or might they not, in which case they will look like jargon. And so here's where you might want to try to step down and illustrate what the concept is if you can't assume people all read it, learned it in a class. But we have to live here and we have to talk here. We have complex things and we have to assume people know some of the language. So jargon is, for me, is an overused and misused term often. Now, this is my favorite piece of scientific writing on earth. It was the actual beginning to an abstract for a seminar presentation in our geography department. We have a world-class geography department, so I presume that whoever was giving a seminar is a world-class geographer. And it reads, access to information is necessary, but not sufficient in our digital era. The challenge is to objectively integrate digital resources based on user-defined objectives for the purpose of discovering information relationships that facilitate interpretations and decision-making. And it went on like this for a long paragraph. My question is really a few, could any of you explain to me what that means and what that person's trying to say? And if you think that it's hard to read, it's because the material is hard or because the writing is hard. It's very easy as readers to assume that I'm struggling because maybe I'm just not smart enough. And that's always the wrong perspective. If you're reading something nice and going, what the heck are they talking about? It's their fault, not yours. So let's figure out why this is hard to read. This comes back to the classic writer's aphorism, show, don't tell. Mark Twain said it differently. He said, don't say the old lady screamed, bring her on and I'll let her scream. I want to see what it is you're saying. I want to see the action. I want to see who did it. So if we look at this, we can ask, where is the action in this little, 2 sentences? It doesn't feel like there's much really at all in terms of real action, but in fact, there are many things here that reflect action. Somebody is accessing information. Somebody is being challenged. Someone is integrating resources. Someone's defining objectives. Someone's discovering relationships. Someone's interpreting results. Someone's making decisions. There's lots of action referred to here, but we can ask, where is the actor? I don't think there's an actor expressed anywhere in this section. No one's doing these things. And that's the real problem, and that's a major issue in why this is so challenging. We can also then ask, where is the verbs? Because verbs are the words that we were supposed to use to express action. Well, they're all the things that are legally verbs. There are 2 is-it, there's 1 infinitive, 2 integrate. Of course, that's a split infinitive, which some people say you shouldn't do. That's bullshit. The only reason this idea of you shouldn't split an infinitive is because in Latin, it's not physically possible. And of course, Latin's the perfect language. So if you can't do it in Latin, don't do it in English. That makes no sense. There's 1 gerund, the discovering, an ing verb, which isn't terribly verby. And there's a couple of Latinate ATE verbs. Any word that ends in ATE was borrowed directly from from Latin and was borrowed probably by the monks who knew Latin to show off what they knew. ATE verbs are suspect. So the verbs aren't very verby here. And this is part also of why it's hard to see the action, hard to figure out what are they really talking about. Now, there are a couple of things that they do wrong in here, and we'll come back and we'll look at those in a sec. And these are common, I think, among science writers. One is fuzzy verbs, because we seem to have a distaste for expressing action, which say that something happened, but don't really say what it did. So here's a sentence that might be in an ecology paper. Spatial variation, so resources, has been quantified in a variety of ecosystems. And there, of course, is the verb. And the real question is, okay, so they've been quantified. But how did they vary? How did you quantify them? It doesn't really tell us anything that we probably really wanted to know. So it really doesn't tell us anything, which means it's wasting space when I need to go from 18 to 15. If I can just jump to saying what my real point is, I save a whole sentence. Now, this too is one of my favorite sentences, this from a PhD dissertation a number of years ago. Herbivores may facilitate the invasion of exotic grasses by mediating competition between exotic and native plants. And the question here is, so what did the herbivores do? Now, if you ask me, I don't really think that herbivores are diplomats. They're not interested in mediating competition. They have no interest in facilitating the invasion. These are all the authors' highfalutin scientific concepts about what herbivores do in ecology. Herbivores don't facilitate or mediate or do any of these other Latinate things. Herbivores eat. Herbivores preferentially eat native plants, giving exotic grasses a competitive advantage that allows them to invade. You can see this isn't really shorter, but it's about 6 times clearer in terms of what you really think or what I think was this person was saying. But because they were using these kind of fuzzy verbs and trying to avoid expressing visible action like eat. My God, that's an Anglo-Saxon word. Why would you use that? That doesn't sound impressive. But you don't impress people with the quality of your vocabulary. You impress people with the clarity of your ideas. This, I understand what the author meant. That one, I really don't. And I have to try to distill it out and read it 3 times to figure out. If I'm having to back up, stop, and read something 3 times, you've lost me and you're not getting funded if it's a proposal, because my chain of thought is broken. The other thing that academics tend to do is, in our hatred of verbs in action, is we use nominalizations a lot. And a nominalization is this phenomenon of turning a verb or an adjective into a noun. And of course, nominalization is a nominalization because it is a process that we've given a name to. So instead of saying something moved, we talk about movement. Instead of saying we investigated something, we conducted an investigation. But if you turn a verb into a noun, well, then you need to add a verb to the sentence for it to be grammatical. And since the action is now named in the nominalization, the verb will almost inherently be fuzzy because it's saying you did something, but not what. We also do this with adjectives. Instead of saying A was different than B, or even better yet, A was higher than B, we say there's a difference between A and B, and now we have to explain it. Instead of saying something was difficult, we talk about the difficulty in dealing with this. So in avoiding these very concrete Anglo-Saxon specific kinds of language, moving into these fuzzier, more nominalized words, it gets longer and it gets harder and more likely to get rejected. So practice working with verbs. So why are they a problem? Here's an example from a real paper. Although models exist to calculate reaction rates as a function of molecular size, a failure to reproduce the experimental data is often observed. Now, that takes a few seconds to figure out what they're really saying with a failure to reproduce. Here, failure is a process, something failed, but failure is a noun nominalized. Instead, you could write it this way. Although models exist to calculate reaction rates as a function of molecular size, they often fail to reproduce the experimental data. It's more powerful. It puts the key term, they often fail, at the beginning of a clause, and beginnings and endings are power positions. It's where you put major points. It's why the OCAR model has the opening and the resolution. That is true within paragraphs. It's true within sentences. The beginning and the end are powerful. That's places readers notice. Things in the middle get buried. So here, a failure to reproduce puts the idea of reproduce into the middle of the clause, and it's weaker. And here, the action that is specified at the end of the sentence is often observed. And that's not the key message. Here, the key message is the models fail. This, by making the verb more active, it makes a sentence shorter and more potent. So really be thinking about these ways of how do I energize my verbs? Learn to love your verbs. So if we come back to this paragraph and fix the verbs, cut out the fluff, which I didn't even really talk about, we will end up with something much shorter. And now I can ask, do you now begin to understand what this person is saying? Access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. Challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships that allow clear interpretation and better decision-making. Or I think an even better version, access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships that allow us to interpret the data more clearly and to make better decisions. All I've done in this is sort of fix the language. And now particularly in version 2, I think I'm beginning to understand a little bit more of what this person's saying is that it's not just about having information, it's how we deal with it to discover new relationships. The important word in this one is us. Who is us? Normally, when you use we or us, we certainly in a paper means the authors. And this is one reason why we often go to sort of depersonalized passive voice and methods. If I say soil samples were collected, that's passive depersonalized. If I say we collected samples, well, I may not have been the one who went to the field. The undergrad assistants who are not co-authors are probably the people who did the work. But since they're not authors and I say we, I'm lying, because I'm saying it's the people who wrote the paper that did it, and we may not have done that. So that's a pace where it works. Here, us, does that mean some sort of global us, or does it mean the authors specifically? I would leave it here because I think it's obvious enough that us in this case really means some larger community, but it also allows us to make these verbs, allows us to interpret data and make decisions as opposed to these nominalized interpretation and decision making, which are still noun forms. So as you look at your and your group members' writing and you think about stuff, really be spending time thinking about how to activate my language, how to make the verbs verby, which for some reason is a very common failing in academic writing. We tend to not do this very much. I look at this and say there's no difference in the intellectual content from the original, but I think the message is now clear. I'm sure it could be said even better if you started over and rewrote, but often the first step is just, how do I make it so I can see what I'm trying to say here? Keep in mind, I said this at the beginning of our first presentation, communication isn't what you give or what you think you gave, it's what the reader actually gets. That is what was communicated. So think about them first and always. And that's really about thinking about your audience. What do they know? Who are you talking to? What is your story? How do I structure that in a way to make it work for the widest possible community, or widest practical, which usually means a little wider than I would in my first draft, where I'm just using my own sort of cursive knowledge framing issues. Structure is critical because the punchline is whatever is at the end of the joke. Whatever those last words are, that's the take-home message. And so think about what you say and where you say it. It's the waypoints of the map that are more important than the wiggles, because mostly we tend to skim over those if we're looking for content when we're reading a paper. Particularly as an editor, I look at the big picture stuff more than the methods. As a grad student, you may be looking at the methods more, but again, you need to get it published. Language is the last one and is something where I think we tend to take stuff for granted to a fairly great degree, and yet it is often very problematic. Partly because we tend to use more words and bigger words. There are other things we certainly could talk about. We often like using adjectives and adverbs, and usually you should not. Modifiers, if all they do is sort of amplify the sense of a word, you usually don't need. Modifiers that change the meaning of a word are valuable. So one example that I borrowed from somebody once upon a time is this idea of if you say, she smiled happily, well, we expect smiles to be happy, so you don't need to say she smiled happily. That's an empty modifier. If you say instead, she smiled sadly, that twists the meaning. That one you can't let go of because it's sort of altering things. So go through and look for what words you can just get rid of. I kind of play a video game with myself. I'll look at every one of my paragraphs and say, wait, that paragraph has 2 words hanging on the bottom of it. If I kill 2 words, I gain an entire whole new line. That's a score. And I will look at that paragraph and will struggle desperately to figure out a way to just cut those 2 words and save that entire line. You do that polishing, focusing where I can get the best bang for the buck in killing words. And all of a sudden you discover your 18-page proposal is now 15 pages and you can submit the sucker. It's also going to be clearer and sharper. Dale in his book, Making a Point, ended up with, it said this thing. So the important thing, the really important thing is to be aware of what the options are. As writers, we have broad toolkits. I think real writers and particularly journalists, train those and really learn to think about those. As scientists, I think we train on the idea that it's the data that is important and how we process the data. And words are suspect. If we think we're language, we distrust what we're reading or writing. And of course, that can get to a point. You can get so playful with language, you actually are undermining the actual science. But if you use your language and use your toolkits well, you're actually just going to be clarifying the message and sharpening it and bringing it into focus for people. What is it I want them to learn? There are several stories I can tell out of this stuff. Which is the one I want to highlight? That will help you be successful. And if you're thinking about dealing with non-science audiences, it's even more important.
But I'd like to thank Dr. Schimel for joining us today. It's incredibly helpful. And I hope you all got something out of it. I know we're all at various stages of our careers, but I think it's always worth visiting.
That's partly because most scientists are crappy writers and do a bad job of it, which is one reason why. And in the next presentation, we'll go through a short example of a piece of the message is simple, but is actually incomprehensible. As we shift in our careers and what we're doing, what we look for in papers, I think varies. You know, when we're trying to learn stuff, we're trying to learn methods and see how you did stuff. And so we often sort of zoom in on detail. But ultimately, what's going to get your work cited is the bigger picture. I mean, unless you came up with some novel method that everybody in the world is going to cite 18 million times. The most highly cited papers are always going to be methods papers, but those aren't ultimately the most influential. What I found when I was looking for examples to use in writing science was randomly grabbing stuff off shelves and looking at stuff. I struggled to find things that were good examples of good writing. My general assessment was that molecular biologists and medical researchers are the worst writers in science. I think that's partly because the field is so huge that you can write for a tiny little slice and still have enough people to get a paper published. There's also lots of very small and technical terms for things. DNA sequences, genes, lots of small stuff. The more theoretical fields I thought generally had some better writing. Chemistry, I found some really nice examples. But most of us don't write very well because most of us went into science because we weren't interested in it. I mean, it was a hard lesson for me when I shifted from being a graduate student at the bench to being a professor, where all of a sudden I discovered, like, oh crap, my job now really is about writing. And that's not what I thought I was interested in, but that's what I have to do. So I look, when I'm working as an editor, as a reviewer, I always look at those OCAR points. It's my first sort of cut. What is the problem? Is this appropriate for my journal? What is your question? Is it interesting? What are your conclusions? What did you learn that I should be putting out to the world for the point of view of a journal? So if you look at things like Nature or Science, they use a slightly different, more front-loaded story structure. So you can see a difference between the specialist journal, where we want to follow your logic to the endpoint and see the punch message there, to if you're trying to convince a Nature editor that they should not just toss your paper on the reject pile right away, it needs to be more front-loaded. So we use different kinds of story structures that way for different types of audience, and proposals must be more front-loaded. Because if by page 3 I'm bored, you're dead. So mostly just look at all the papers. You'll find some well-written papers in any journal where you can see they're doing a good job of that communication, and you can see a lot where it's just sort of standard boilerplate language that you struggle. And if, as a reader, you're struggling to figure out the messaging, that's the author's problem. That means they didn't do a good job, and mostly they don't. Think about the detail-specific concepts that you deal with a lot, and see if you move a step back from those. Another thing to keep in mind is where you introduce a term in a sentence flags whether you think readers know it. If you put something at the beginning of a sentence, you're assuming readers know what that word means. You don't have to define an aromatic molecule to a chemist. That's the third grader model. If you put a new term for the first time at the end of a sentence, you're defining it, and that says, I kind of assume you don't know this. If you're not sure, you want to do that kind of remind people that might not quite know the word. You can sort of bury it in the middle in a little sort of, in the middle. So there are ways of sort of calibrating that. And your goal when you're writing papers is to figure out not just what your smallest possible target audience, people who know all of my research, a little bit wider. How wide can you engage it before you start losing people because it starts looking trivial? There's no magic to that. But it is, so at the journal I edit, so Biology, Biochemistry, we get tons of papers from China. And most of them start with this. In China, we have this problem because that's what they wrote to get the grant funding, to do the work. And that's why that paper gets rejected instantly when it hits an international general audience journal. Because I really don't care about Chinese problems. But most of those problems occur everywhere else in the world as well. These are general issues if you chose to frame them that way. And so it's to think about, how can I just step outside my narrowest perspectives a little, and you'll get a few more readers, a few more sites, a little more recognition, a little more career success. But there's no simple formula for that. It's just, wait, I just used the word that I'm so used to, measured mineralization. Every field has them. We need them. We can't talk about stuff without a common base of language. But look at the words you're using. And it's also one reason why circulating papers through writers groups and are really valuable, because your readers will flag on some of those things. My other secret is read things out loud to myself. If I'm writing icky sentences, I will stumble over them. And I find that very effective. Also, print it out. Don't ever submit anything that you haven't actually printed on paper and read on paper. It gives you a different look at things and different ways of reading things than it does on screen. It's really quite amazing. Yeah, so the ending, your last words of a paper should be what is it, if I read nothing else, what do you want me to take away from this? That's really always true in all communication. One of my pet peeves I see is that, so in a paper, there's acknowledgements. How many of you ever read the acknowledgements? We don't, it's after the paper. In talks, almost everybody ends on a final acknowledgement slide. So the thing that's actually sitting in front of your audience while they're doing Q&A, the slide they may look at the longest is the one slide that nobody in the room gives a shit about, to be honest. Nobody cares who helped you with research. So why is that the thing that actually becomes your functional conclusion slide? And I've seen people whip through their conclusions to get to the acknowledgements, and as opposed to leaving their conclusions sitting in front of the people while they're thinking, reading. It's about this, well, I see other people do this, so I do it that way. It's important to say thank you. It's important to say, yeah, there's stuff that I still haven't figured out. But that should never be your take-home message, the last thing your readers are seeing and thinking about. So put that somewhere else, either in the middle of a paragraph. If the limitations of the methods are really important in understanding the science, put them at the beginning of the discussion. I have written papers where I've had methodological consideration sections where I talk about, yeah, this method is so artificial, it won't do this, it won't do this, it won't do this, but it does allow us to do this. Now, having laid that out, I can talk about that and frame a solid story. In a paragraph, the beginning of a paragraph kind of defines what it's about, and paragraphs either are point first or point last. In grade school, we learned that all paragraphs have a topic sentence that tells us about what it's at. That's a simplifying fiction. Paragraphs need an opening to sort of set us what the paragraph is about, but sometimes the point is the last sentence of the paragraph. Just as with a paper, it can either be front-loaded if you're writing for Nature or the New York Times, where no one's ever going to read your final paragraph because they may never go to the end, page 7. So it all has to be front-loaded. Or the point can be at the end. And in that way, in third grade or wherever they taught us about topic sentences, they were giving us a simple starting model, not the real whole package. So at every level, even in a sentence, first words sort of set what it's about. This is what we're talking about. Last words in a sentence are what's the point of the sentence. You can stuff stuff in the middle that you want to, incidental or hide. This idea of beginning and endings are power positions and middles are weak work at every single level of the hierarchy of writing. And so learning to use position is key in all of these things, whether we're looking at sentences or paragraphs. And we're looking at trying to make paragraphs that connect to each other. Starting paragraphs with words that sort of reach back to the one before is what develops flow and continuity and allows something to just roll through. What you want is readers to not let go. You want to grab your readers by the nose and not have them kind of pulling back for a moment to think, wait, what are you saying? Because if they're not just following your flow, they're thinking for themselves and not just accepting your messages. And a proposal, you want them to go, yeah, that's great, that's cool, fund it. The minute in any panel discussion I've ever been on for review proposals, or someone said, this is a really great proposal, but man, the first blood in the water in the Quran are picking and needling that proposal to death. The ones that get funded are the ones where everyone just goes, way cool, and don't get into the detail. So don't give them the opportunity to sort of pop out and go, oh, what are they thinking about? Yeah, so a proposal is saying, I know I don't know. And that way, that's a way of expressing confidence. There's something that either we don't know, and I can tell you why I think we need to, or there's something that we've been seeing wrong that I think I can fix. we all know that proposals are all science fiction in some sense. You're not really going to do everything you say you're going to do. If you knew enough to write the perfect proposal, you knew enough that you didn't need to write it. So what you're doing is saying there's this hole in our understanding, here's why it's important, and I can confidently sort of frame that gap in. It's not that little is known about this topic. None of us work on stuff where little is known about the topic. It's rather that we know a whole lot about the topic, but there's this piece right here. We know this, but we don't know this. We know this, we know this, we know this. There's a gap here, and I can tell you why filling that gap is important. And I think I know how I'm going to do that. Here's how I'm going to approach that. So it's important to be confident about your ignorance. I mean, there's a wonderful little book by Stuart Firestein at Columbia called Ignorance, How It Drives Science, and it is about, the power of our ignorance that hooks people and gets them excited. It's like, wait, we don't know that? Wow, I didn't realize we didn't know that, but I want to. That's how you sell a proposal. I had one once where I was looking at soil organic matter and whether it's bioavailable. I had several different methods in there, and it kind of got hammered because people picked on some of my methods and, well, that doesn't really quite say that, and that doesn't really quite say that. So I resubmitted it. And for each of those, I said, okay, this is what this method does say. Here's what it doesn't, but here's how we kind of twist that to use that. And I went through that piece by piece. And my brother, who happened to be on the panel that was reviewing it, wasn't, of course, in the room while they talked about it, but he came back in afterwards and it was right up at the top that people really liked the fact, apparently, that I really did just go through this is what this doesn't tell, and use that as a way of the yes butting and to cover those weaknesses without a lot of, just, oh, well, so just being very upfront about it and very honest about it really can be very effective. And if you're not sure if a method will work, well, if it's central to the proposal, go do the preliminary work so that you can show some confidence, because otherwise they say, we don't know this will work. Other things where, well, this might not work, but if it doesn't, I have some other way of achieving the goal. Just as in this kind of analogy of strategy and tactics, military planning is based on the concept that no plan survives. Every plan will fall apart, but every plan starts with commander's intent. No matter what else goes wrong, this is what you must achieve. This is the goal, and so as long as you show people how you're going to do that, even in the things where you think it might work, you'll be in pretty good shape. And it just means owning your ignorance and your insecurities on that stuff, and being open and upfront about them. In papers too, yeah, there are questions that remain, but there are things we have learned that are real. End with that positive message. And do that with a proposal too. Proposals are sold or killed in their first 2 pages. You still need a good wrap up to sort of, when people have been, as I always say, I read the first half on the flight into Chicago and the second half on the flight out. You remind me of what you want me to say in the review at the end of it, to pull the pieces back together. Even the proposals, if someone once said, if you haven't told me in the first 2 pages, you haven't told me. Proposals are sold on the power of their question, not on the power of their answers. And so that really means a more front-loaded structure and hitting on the question, not just the, I've got some cool method. I don't bother looking at the abstracts when I'm reviewing papers or handling these as an editor. I skip over them, and I even more so skip over cover letters. I pay no attention to them whatsoever. I go straight to the paper and what it's trying to tell me. So I look first at the problem, that opening, is this appropriate for my journal? And then I go to some of these other key places where, what is the question as I'm skimming through it, because as the chief editor of SBMB or editor-in-chief, the first time doing, does this go out for external review, or can I just reject it without that? If it makes it through that triage state of, this is fundamentally worthwhile, and I do this when I'm reviewing papers too, if it's fundamentally has potential, then everything after that should be trying to help make it better. But that first cut is just, does this have what it takes? Which is why when I see papers from China whose first words are in China, I always want to say, look, if your first words are in China, just write it in Chinese. It's going to be much easier for you. But you're talking to a Chinese audience, so why are you framing it this way? But I think that's very much the kind of curse of knowledge problem. You wrote the proposal to deal with one set of problems, but now you need to twist your thinking to deal with different audience so that you're talking to their concerns. And that's why if you're talking to scientists versus politicians versus lay public, the language and the framing of the story needs to change, because we're all asking the same question. How does this benefit me? Why should I take my time to read your work? And we're all looking for those kind of shorthands of how we can streamline that process. And so, I think some people may read abstracts. I tend to skip them.